Good morning. Let me welcome all of you as you've been welcomed already, but let me add to that welcome. And start by recognizing again the former Senator Hagel, Secretary Hagel, for his leadership role in organizing this amazing symposium. Also to Chancellor John Christensen and the sponsors of this event, the Union Pacific Railroad, the Kiewit Company, Gallup, and a grant from the Humanities Nebraska. I'll remind you, you have cards available to formulate questions, which you'll send up here, or people will collect them in the aisles, and we'll save time at the latter part of the program for your questions. The title of this session is The U.S. Military After Vietnam. And our purpose is to discuss how the war affected and changed military training and doctrine. My name is Ken Stinson. I'm honored to be the moderator of this panel. I'm the retired chairman and CEO of the Peter Kiewit Sons Incorporated Company, third largest contractor in North America. I served 2.5 tours in Vietnam with the U.S. Navy Seabees and the Seabee Construction Battalion, supporting Marine and Army efforts in I-Corps, the northern part of South Vietnam, during the years 1966 to 1969. We are really privileged to have as our panelists today two distinguished individuals who have served our country at the highest level. Their pedigrees are long, extensive, and amazing, and in the interest of time, though, their introduction will be very abbreviated compared to their long list of accomplishments. Let me start with former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. As I assume you know, is a native Nebraskan who graduated from the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 1971. He is a maverick through and through. If you've followed his career, you know that. Prior to attending UNO, Chuck served alongside his brother Tom as an Army infantry squad leader in Vietnam in 1967 and 68. Chuck was awarded 2 Purple Hearts and Tom 3 during their tour of duty. And we're honored to have Tom join with us here for this event, and I think Tom's in the audience. I haven't spotted him, but Tom, if you're here, would you stand up and be recognized also, please? Okay, well, let's pretend Tom was here and give him a round of applause. Yeah, if he was here, he probably would say, I've heard Chuck before.
Never agrees with a damn thing I say.
After receiving his degree at UNO, Chuck served as a staffer for Congressman John Y. McAllister for 6 years, and then 2 years as Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration. After this period of service, Chuck put on his private sector hat. He co-founded Vanguard Cellular in 1982, and in 1992 moved to Omaha, or back to Omaha, to become president of McCarthy Group. In 1966, Nebraskans elected Chuck to the U.S. Senate. He was reelected in 2002 with 83% of the vote. That's the largest margin of victory of any Nebraska statewide election in history. In the Senate, Chuck served on many years on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Select Committee on Intelligence. In 2009, after electing not to run for a third term in the Senate, Chuck was appointed by President Obama as co-chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, a very important board which serves as a close advisor to the President on security matters. As you are aware, in 2013, Chuck was appointed the 24th Secretary of Defense, the only Vietnam veteran and the first enlisted combat veteran to serve in that role. Our other panelist is General Martin Dempsey. General Dempsey recently retired after 41 years in military service. Incredible record during that period of time. He commanded a cavalry troop, a tank battalion, cavalry regiment, tank division, the United States Central Command, where he was responsible for securing U.S. interests in the Middle East and South Asia. And he served in both Operation Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, accumulating 42 months combat in-country combat. General Dempsey is a 1974 graduate of West Point. He has a master's degree from Duke University, the Army Command and General Staff College, and the National War College. He also holds an honorary degree in law from the University of Notre Dame. Most recently, he served as Chief of Staff of the United States Army and subsequently as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where he had the senior officer responsibility in the armed forces and was military advisor to the Secretary of Defense and the President. In 2015, General Dempsey was named one of 100 most influential leaders in the world by Time magazine. I just found out he was recently knighted by the Queen of England too. So it's Sir Martin, I believe. In 2016, and this might be his proudest accomplishment, he was inducted into the Irish American Hall of Fame and also received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. So we're delighted to have these two distinguished individuals be here for this panel. We are scheduled to conclude at 10:50. I'm going to, as I say, attempt to leave some time at the end for questions, and we'll have those cards distributed. So let's start with the questions. I'd like to start with General Dempsey and kick off the discussion with the following question. The war in Vietnam has been characterized as a combination of guerrilla war, conventional war, aerial war, riverine warfare. In any event, warfare unlike any previous U.S. conflict in modern times. You graduated from West Point in 1974 as the U.S. role in Vietnam was concluding. Could you share with us how, during your 4 years at West Point, what your impressions were as you're preparing for a career in the Army and this war is going on under a lot of debate? What were your impressions during that period of time? And then the second part, as part of your training then and perhaps subsequently, what were the differences that were evolving or had evolved in doctrine and strategy and tactics that were impacted and changed by the Vietnam War?
Thanks, Ken. If I first could say what a delight it is to be back with Secretary Hagel. He, navigating through the treacherous waters of Washington, D.C. is difficult under any circumstances. It can be made even more difficult if the people for whom you work and who are around you are tough to work with. But it was an honor, sir, to work with you and to advise you. And thanks for your unbelievable service. Thanks to UNO for hosting this event. I think it's really important. To answer, by the way, I should mention, the thing about the world's most influential leaders. I appeared in that magazine, by the way, between Kanye West and Kim Jong-un. So, I'm not making that up. If you go back and look, it's me with, looking very professional, and then Kim Jong-un, look, with the really bad haircut. So I never take those things too seriously, actually. To answer your question about the, going through West Point as the war began to culminate, you have to remember I was 18, and so I think we have some, anybody up there 18 years old? How self-aware are you about, what are you really worried about? Don't answer that question. No, look, I was well aware of what was going on around me. Coming through high school, we watched, as was mentioned earlier, young men get draft lottery numbers and go off to war, and we saw some of them come back and some of them not come back. I went to West Point. All of my instructors, 100% of them, and the professors, were all Vietnam veterans. We even had some Vietnam veterans in our class who had come out of serving as enlisted soldiers and decided to try their hand at West Point. So it was a constant presence. It was discussed. It was debated. It was debated in a way that I think you would be happy that it was debated. I mean, we weren't just blindly waiting to put on our uniforms and march off to war. We questioned tactics. We lived through all of the crises, vicariously, through the media and through our professors, whether it was, the My Lai massacre or whether it was, the Tet Offensive. I mean, those were real events. Well, Tet had been before that. But the point is, it was a constant presence. And one of the things that happens to you when you're watching a war unfold and you know that you are likely to go is you start to, first of all, you take the training part of it a lot more seriously, obviously. The second thing is you wonder, are you going to measure up? And so all of our classmates, we would talk about these things. And then, as we matriculated through West Point, it was pretty clear by the early parts of 1972 that it was highly unlikely that we would go to war. And then the crisis of conscience wasn't, will I measure up it? Oh my God, what is the Army going to be after Vietnam? We still had, conveniently, the Soviet Union was still our principal adversary. But it really was it was an inflection point, and we had to work through it, and we worked through it with some great all of my mentors in the early days, guys like Rick Shinseki and Fred Franks, and guys whose names you had never heard, but they were all Vietnam veterans. And so, we grew up learning about small unit tactics, about courage, about deployments, about the effect on families. I recently was at Duke and a seminar, had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, and Madeline Stowe, the actress who played Hal Moore's wife in We Were Soldiers Once and Young, was there, and we talked for a long time about that role and how seriously she took it. So it was always there. It was the thing you woke up with in the morning and the thing you thought about last at night. What are the lessons? Almost too many to catalog, and I'll just say this. When the nation decides to go to war, and of course that's the important phrase, when the nation decides to go to war, it decides how much to invest in that war based on the degree to which the conflict threatens our national interest. When there's an existential threat to the country, when the country itself is threatened, whether someone can reach it or attack it or change it in some way, you tend to fight a war, and there's almost no limits to what you're willing to do and how many resources you're willing to expend. When the war is fought on behalf of an ally or on behalf of an ideology or on behalf of an economic interest, you will inevitably find yourself ratcheting up and back the amount of resources you're willing to expend. Now, that's a tough pill to swallow if you're wearing the uniform. But it's just the way our system is designed. The system prioritizes sometimes. Look, everybody knows this. When the president was elected in 2008, this president ran on a platform that said he would spend more time on domestic agendas. He would emphasize foreign policy as opposed to military power, and he would extract us from the Middle East. That's not a surprise to anyone. And then he said about doing that. That was a deliberate decision by an elected official to ratchet back the use of the military instrument of power. Lately, it's actually, if you've noticed, it's kind of been ratcheted back up. So one of the lessons, probably the biggest lesson for me in watching how how the war was conducted, how it started, how it ended, what happened afterwards, what happened 20 years later, is that you have to anticipate that these conflicts in which we find ourselves are very dynamic. They just change, and you have to change with them.
Thank you. Chuck, a question for you. It's somewhat parallel, but from a different perspective. So you're in Vietnam in 1967, 68, time frame of the biggest buildup of the war, I think arguably the most intense fighting. 1968 was the year of the Tet Offensive, which many would argue was a turning point in the war. You're a squad leader, sergeant in the infantry. You're leading your men into battle on a regular basis. What was your perspective of the war in terms of its winnability? Were we changing tactics at the squad level at that time? What was happening in your mind in 67, 68 with regard to military strategy, tactics, commitment, and ultimately the potential to, quote unquote, win the war?
Ken, thank you. And before I answer the question, let me add my thanks to the University of Nebraska at Omaha and its leaders and students and all who have contributed in putting this together today. Ken, thank you for your service. Ken Stinson and I have been good friends for many, many years, and what he's done for our community and our state is rather significant. So to have you up here doing this, Ken, and the service you've given to our country, thank you. To my friend Marty Dempsey, I was very privileged to have an opportunity to be Marty Dempsey's partner when we worked together at the Pentagon, and when I called him about his interest in coming out here to participate in this event, I assured him that it would be more fun than our trips to the Hill. But he just said it was a low bar, so so we had some exhilarating experiences together in testimony before Congress. We didn't actually talk a lot. The committee did the talking, but he was pleased to hear that he would be treated better out here on the prairie. So to all of you, thank you also for taking time, and to the veterans in this audience, in particular the Vietnam veterans, thank you for your service. Ken, as to your question, as a young 21-year-old, just freshly minted sergeant after 2 months being a private first class because you made rank quickly, as many of you know, unfortunately, in those days, I was not thinking grand geopolitical strategic thoughts. But that said, sometimes the clearest thinking is done at the bottom. And I say that because it is the men and women at the bottom who have to do the fighting and the dying and the suffering. Marty knows this through his time and leadership in wars in Iraq in particular. And those of you who've experienced this know exactly what I'm talking about. And as we progress through that year, 1968, to your question, Ken, about were tactics changing, were things changing, they were changing not so much tactically, but in response to what was going on outside of our ability to influence on the battlefield, meaning, you mentioned Tet. The end of January 1968, that really was a turning point because the American people started to turn at that point because Walter Cronkite made his famous comments about we're essentially losing in Vietnam. Something Marty Dempsey said is really critical. When a nation goes to war, it must be a nation going to war, and it must be for a very high, clear purpose. Vietnam never was that war. And so what was happening even to us on the battlefield, engaged in the fighting in '68, because we did get Armed Forces radio and Stars and Stripes, and we got letters from home, and so we were not isolated, that what was happening here in the United States, assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of Robert Kennedy that year in 1968, Tet, the American people, the media, were starting to take a different view of Vietnam. That affected the men and women on the ground, and I say that not to blame anybody, but that was just a fact of life, and that's what happens in any war. And again, going back to Marty Dempsey's point, if a nation goes to war, they better have a very clear purpose. That purpose needs to be understood and supported by the American people. Vietnam never was. But I said something the other day as to things were changing, and we had huge racial problems too, reflective of what was going on in the United States. My brother Tom and my platoon leader, Lieutenant Jerome Johnson, is sitting down here in the front row, and I learned an awful lot from this young lieutenant from Chicago, as my brother Tom did. But what was going on here in the country was also going on in the institution of the United States Army and our armed forces at the same time we were fighting a war. against an enemy we weren't quite sure of. And so when you add all that up, most likely it was not going to end well. And by the end of '68, and I think getting more to your question, Ken, even those of us at the bottom, we were sensing a real shift in what was going on in the war, because what was getting through to us, those of us who had the responsibility of going in and out of these villages, and many of you who served know this, we would take a hill or we would take a village, we would take an area, and then 2 weeks later we'd give it back up because we'd change a tactic on, well, we don't need that now. Well, we might have taken considerable number of casualties in doing that. And so you can only do that a couple of times when your troops start questioning, well, what is the strategy here? What is the tactic? What's the purpose of all this? And that was going on. And then there were drug issues and alcohol issues and a real breakdown in discipline. And I'm sure Marty was getting this at West Point as a young lieutenant because of all of your instructors were coming back. And this is what was I've always thought, and as I progressed through different things I had the privilege to do in my life when I got back, was a huge burden on people like General Dempsey. These young lieutenants were coming out of West Point and out of our academies having the responsibility of essentially rebuilding our military to assure that this didn't happen again within the purview of what the military can control. I mean, the military answers to the civilian government. That's our Constitution. I think that's as it should be. But within the institution itself, they had this huge responsibility to essentially restructure it and get us back together as a cohesive institution. And they did it spectacularly well. And I've always admired, for many reasons, people like Marty who did that and spent the last 40 years of service in making our military a military today that's not just professional, but it is truly top to bottom the finest military I think we've ever seen. And but last point I'd make: this is taking nothing away from the men and women who served in Vietnam or Korea or any other conflict or war. I've always believed that the Vietnam generation that served in that war has always gotten a little bit of a short shrift, not because of no parades or no welcome home, so on. I get that. We've kind of made up for that. But what has not been valued, I don't think, and has been made very clear over the years, is the uncommon courage that I saw that these young men principally displayed at a time they were in an uncertain war, a war where the American people were not really behind them. We were not separating the war from the warrior, but yet these men and some women served admirably with tremendous courage. They did their job, they did what their country asked them to do, and they went home and tried to put their lives back together. That's a big deal. And it's not glorious, but it was pretty special, and I think that generation, I say that not because of me, I was just a small little teeny pebble in the whole process, but what I saw happen with this great selfless group of men and women and how they conducted themselves in a very difficult situation.
Just a brief reflection on your comment about taking a hill and then giving it up days later. You may recall a place called Quezon in the Tet Offensive in 1968. I had a small contingent from my company of Seabees up there that were rebuilding the runway and building bunkers. We did have the best bunkers there, by the way. But here Quezon was seen as potentially in the world, I think, a lot of notoriety, the potential Dien Bien Phu of the Vietnam, U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And I don't know how many lives were lost, or I don't recall how many days or weeks it all went on. But as soon as the process stopped, whatever stopped the process, the Vietnamese left, we left, and Quezon, if you visited today, just a small little spot in the southern part of, middle part of Vietnam that means nothing to anybody strategically or tactically or for any reason. And I think that example was very recognized by the troops in the field when I was there, at least. And what are we doing here? Let me move on to another question, and it relates to what you've been talking about. But World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam all relied on the conscription of large numbers of citizens to execute strategy. And I think if you surveyed the veterans from Vietnam that are here today, much higher percentage were conscripted, were drafted than not. And so it really gets to the question, the opposition of the war centered a lot, an important rallying point was opposition to the draft. So how did this opposition influence our military leaders, not so much then, but after that, as they contemplated and strategized U.S. engagement in future military conflicts and whether we could or could not rely on a draft to mobilize large numbers of soldiers? And General Dempsey or Secretary Hagel, I'll throw it to either one of you to.
Well, that decision was taken out of my hands because by the time I graduated and was commissioned, we had abolished the draft and we had started on a path to produce an all-volunteer force. But the question became, for guys like General Abrams, the Chief of Staff in 73, 74, was when, not if, when we go to war next, how do we keep the American people connected? Because if it's just an all-volunteer force and it can be used and deployed and redeployed without any real connection to the general populace, we're going to have a problem. And so his answer was he put certain capabilities into the reserve component, knowing that that would force our elected officials, who again are the responsible agents for making the decision to use the military, it would force them to confront the reality that it's going to affect the American people. So what we've got now is a system where, although we've got an all-volunteer force, it can't deploy without the reserves and the National Guard because there's certain capabilities in those components that are absolutely necessary.
Well, I would only add to what Marty has said that today, picking up on what Marty's point was about the reserves, National Guard, that component now of our national security enterprise, reserves and National Guard, are an essential now critical component. And just as Marty said, that gave some dimension of assurance that you would continue to have the American public connected into decisions and sacrifices. I've always been concerned that and there's no perfect system, as we know. I think it was the right decision back in 1972 to abolish the draft and go toward an all-volunteer professional service. But there's always the downside of that concern, which I think is significant. If you disconnect the American people too much from their so-called elite professional fighting force, it could become and can become kind of a separate entity that's I don't think good or helpful or healthy for a democracy. Almost a Hessian kind of a style military, and it's critical that we keep the American people connected into this always, every step of the way. And it's something that I think our political leaders will have to continue to focus on. Certainly our military is captive to the system, and I think the decisions that were made when I was there as Secretary of Defense, and Marty did a magnificent job of assuring the integration of the head of the National Guard into the Joint Chiefs. And there's always a bit of a rub between the active Army and the National Guard, and because the politics of it get a little dodgy occasionally, where the National Guard has the political clout from the home state senators and congressmen, and so you get into that. But I think has been managed very well, and I think it's the right thing to do. But the connection with the American people is critical. Last point I'd make on this is why I've always thought educational institutions, all our institutions are important in the American people having formats and forums to stay tuned to what's going on and connected into military affairs. And in particular, organizations like veterans groups, because the veterans groups are now part of the fabric of a community. So the American Legion, VFW, DAV, the new ones that have been built, that have risen from the Iraq-Afghan war veterans, their voice is really important because I think it does continue to keep that civilian community connected into our military.
Thank you. We've got some questions. Several actually relate to the last question I was going to pose here, which relates to the fact that I think many of us think of the Vietnam War, the uniqueness of it partly is related to jungles and rice paddies and terrain that we were unused to compared to Korea, World War II, World War I. So now we're fighting in the desert and the treacherous mountains of Afghanistan, or we have been. Are the lessons of Vietnam relevant? And if so, or are we learning new lessons, or have we learned new lessons in those conflicts?
No, they're absolutely relevant. In fact, if you think about the things you just mentioned, you know, whether it's rivers or mountains or forests or deserts, those are conditions. Because the conflict itself is actually among people. You know, war, the nature of war has not changed since the first caveman decided he wanted the other guy's cave, you know, and went over there with a big old sledge and tried to fight his way in there. It's a contest of wills among people. It's fundamentally a human enterprise. And as a result, the lessons are actually quite applicable. Everything else is a condition that you have to react to. I mean, just for example, a couple of them. You know, in Vietnam, you all worked on an individual replacement system. So the unit's flag stayed there almost the entire time of the conflict, and people rotated in and out. As a result of that, we felt, when we looked at an extended conflict in the Middle East, we felt that individual replacement was difficult because there was constant turnover. You know, every month you might lose 10 to 15 to 20% of your organization. So we deployed units, and the unit would stay there sometimes for 12 months, sometimes for 15 months on occasion, sometimes for 9 months. Now that one has had problems on occasion, you know, so as you said, sir, there's no perfect answer to these things. But the lesson of how do you deploy into, how long can you reasonably expect someone to remain in a combat environment? You know, the comparison is made to World War II, you know, where we're going over and we ain't coming back till it's over there. That was actually World War I. But that's in a conflict where it's kind of, you know, episodes of violence with long periods of maneuver and in some cases boredom. In the kind of conflicts we're in now, including Vietnam, including Iraq, including Afghanistan, you know, it's a 360-degree, 24/7 issue. And so, you know, we've been struggling to determine, and I think have done a pretty good job of how long can you reasonably expect someone to be in there. Second, the military instrument is a wonderful instrument of national power, but it is not ever enough by itself. And so if an elected official intends to use the military instrument of power, you can count on military leaders and people like the Secretary of Defense to say, okay, we got that, we'll provide some options, but where's the reconstruction, where's the governance, where's the economic, where's the information, you know, where's all the other things that take the kind of conflicts where it's fundamentally about failed states? Where's everybody else? Because if you're just going to send the military, it will do what you asked it to do, but what you ask it to do won't be enough. And you're just going to be there for longer, and the issues that caused it in the first place are going to persist. So that was another example of Vietnam. There was kind of there were kind of cycles where the village pacification programs and the engagement with the population were points of emphasis, and then there were points where there just was no emphasis. And that's a formula for problems. So, I mean, there's many lessons like that. There's one arm of service. You can't bomb people. I know there's probably some Air Force veterans in the audience who are going to be angry with me about this. But you can't just bomb your enemy into submission. It's just not, I mean, unless you're going to use weapons of mass destruction that are just unimaginable. But if you're going to fight a war morally and ethically, as we tend to try to do, you're going to have more than one arm of service involved. And so bombing campaigns were, based on your experience when it was my turn, bombing campaigns caused me to cringe a bit, frankly, because it didn't seem to be enough.
Well, I agree with everything General Dempsey said, and I would just add a couple of points that maybe just to amplify on what he said. One, the use of a military, especially in a democracy, our military, it always must fit within the larger strategic plan and policy. You can't lead with your military, and I think we have made some mistakes over the years in trying to project our military first and then come back around and answer the questions we should have asked first. What happens then? Who governs? What kind of a country is it? Legitimacy of government. Who rebuilds the country? Economy. And we tend to reverse that. And that's certainly, in many ways, a lesson learned from Vietnam. I think it also applies to our current situations in the Middle East. It always has to be used within the framework, military power, military instrument, of the larger context of a political policy and objective. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't employ your military, because it'll never work. And it'll also end up in a constant cycle where you seem to never get out. I really believe in an old adage that easy to get into war, not very easy to get out of war. And again, I think that's a lesson learned from Vietnam, and certainly not unfamiliar with where we are in the Middle East, in Afghanistan today. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't ever use military. Of course not. Military is an enforcement mechanism, but it has to be an enforcement of a larger strategic objective and policy and power. I think also why it's so valuable to go back and look at these things, whether it's Vietnam, World War II, and Marty knows National Defense University, all our academies still go back and look at battles from World War II, or look at strategies from World War II, certainly Korea, Vietnam. And there's always, as Marty said, a lesson to be learned. But I would start with the fundamental of what Marty talked about in the larger context of when and where and how you use your militaries. The fact is, just as Marty began his answer, war is a human decision. It's not a machine decision. It's a human decision, and that's where you start. And if you don't start there, then it'll never come out. It'll never come out right. It is our decision as human beings whether we want to go to war or not. But it's got to be for a very clear purpose. All that reflects in a cycle, I think, Ken, of what we can learn from Vietnam.
Please.
I failed to complete my thought. So my assertion is that the nature of war never changes. It's a contest of wills among living and breathing human beings, and therefore you're just never exactly sure where it's going to go. So the nature of war never changes. The character of war does. The tools that we use, I don't think anybody ever used the word cyber in Vietnam, right? But now that's all we talk about in some cases. So the character of war can change, the tools can change, the conditions can change, but the nature doesn't change. And that's a lesson that, really I think deserves to be remembered.
Thank you, thank you. This is a bit of it. Thank you all for all the questions. I'm unfortunately probably not going to be able to get to all of them, but I tried to consolidate in my mind a few. This is one that is an interesting question given your two roles historically. The question is, could you please talk about the role of a senior leader in voicing disagreement with policy? Thinking here of Colin Powell disagreeing. Well, the perspective is slightly different from a senior military officer and an appointed senior leader in the government. I know Chuck has managed to piss off two presidents, best I can tell, on a very bipartisan way. So let me hand that one over. First with you, we kind of know what Chuck thinks about it, but would you please? Yeah. So you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You don't agree with, as a hypothetical example, the president's policy or strategy or whatever. Yeah. What obligation or constraint do you have in expressing your views?
I never felt any constraint in providing what I characterized as advice. Nor did I ever conclude that the president, or for that matter, the Secretary of Defense, had to take my advice. I think what they counted upon was, they actually, and I found this to be true, they actually wanted my advice, even if at times it made them uncomfortable, or in the case of the president, if it rubbed uncomfortably into something else he was trying to accomplish. So I never felt any constraints about giving advice. And, there is a bit of a delicate balance in giving advice and then consulting with Congress, because I had an obligation to give advice, a statutory obligation to be the advisor to the Secretary, the advisor to the President, and to consult with Congress. And those of you that study our nation know that, or our Constitution know that Article 1, which established the Congress, puts in there the authority to go to war. Article 2, which establishes the executive branch, puts in there the position of the president as commander-in-chief. And the founders did that on purpose, so that these two organizations and bodies and branches of government would be in tension on the issue of warfare. And that's a problem for the chairman, because he's got to provide advice on the one hand and consult on the other. And if you ever, are looking for something to do on a rainy day afternoon, go back and YouTube some of our appearances before Congress, because when that friction accrues, it can be pretty testy.
I might make a distinction, or you would make the distinction, that advising the president or the Congress in open session or privately is different than going public with your views that might be opposed to the administration. I think we all understand that.
Well, Ken, thank you for the compliments.
That's what friends are for, Chuck.
My career's never been described with two presidents exactly like that, but it's clear and direct. Well, first, I've said to President Obama on more than one occasion, and this is one of the responsibilities the Secretary of Defense has in consultation with senior officers, on recommending to the President the next set of leaders, the next chairman, the next Chief of Staff of the Army, STRATCOM commander, and so on. And I always took that responsibility very seriously. And I used to say to the President, Mr. President, each one of those jobs requires a different skill set. So you could have a very, very good and effective chief of a service, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs skill set is a whole different and more complicated set of skills. And don't look at me that way, Marty. It's a compliment. It's all right. And so I think I answer the question kind of from my perspective as a political appointee, starting with that, because Marty did that and handled his responsibilities as chairman as well as I think any chairman I've ever seen, and I've worked with all of them since I first started working for Congressman John McCollister back in the early 70s. And it's a tough job for the very reasons that revolve around your question and Marty's answer. Now, for the political appointee, it can get a little uncomfortable because I used to say in the Senate, when I was often vilified by my own party for questioning the war in Iraq, I was called all kinds of names, an un-American and so on. But I used to say, because I didn't support my Republican president on a particular issue, I used to say everybody in this body took an oath of office, as the military does, to the Constitution of the United States. I didn't take an oath of office to a political party. And I tried to make every decision in the Senate, as Secretary of Defense, and every piece of advice I gave the President based on that first. Yes, I have to support the President's policies. I'm an instrument of the administration. And if it gets to a point where you just can't do it anymore, then there'll have to be some other arrangements. But you have to also go up and testify. The military, in some ways, is a bit insulated from this because you're the military. So you march to whatever the commander-in-chief says, whatever the civilian government says. A political appointee who has been pretty much independent as a United States Senator goes up and testifies, maybe on issues, and you have to say things that you don't agree with. And doesn't mean you lie, doesn't mean you deceive, but what you're saying is, this is the administration's decision, this is the President's policy, and what members of Congress often will do, and Marty and I were talking about this on the plane yesterday, is the different members of Congress say, no, Mr. Chairman or Secretary, I know what the President's policy is. What do you think? So that puts you in a little different situation. So it's a difficult spot, but you have to just accept that as a reality in order to do your job. But I never ever saw in all the jobs I've had a time when anyone was blocked from giving their advice or tried to be intimidated. Now, in a political job, they come at you a little different way. I mean, that's for a different panel. But overall it works. But you just accept that before you ever take the job, that those are the realities.
We have about a minute to go, so this may be a brief answer, but we have a question from a student who I suspect is probably planning her life and her goals and career and so forth. And the question is, both of you are very accomplished people. So what role did the Vietnam War play in what you decided to do in your life? I think your participation, Chuck, and General Dempsey, your engagement from your time at West Point and thereafter.
I'll give a very brief answer. I've always felt that each of us in our lives are privileged just to be born here in the United States. Start there. And each of us owe the country something. And if it fits in a career or fits in opportunities to do different things, and everybody in this room does different things their way, your timetable, whether it's Boy Scouts or coaching or whatever it is, teaching. And I just have always kind of had that attitude, and I've been lucky and fortunate and privileged to have been able to get to some of the big jobs that gave me even more opportunity to contribute. So that's kind of been my standard.
Yeah, I carry some cards in my pocket, and I have other cards on my desk in a box. And every job I've had since 2003, and the box is engraved, "Make it matter," because even back at West Point, I mean, we were honor guards for graduates who were being buried at the cemetery, the military cemetery at West Point. So, and some of them I knew personally, and so, you know, I had this sense that some were actually giving all on behalf of the country. And then when I was privileged enough to lead soldiers and lost some of them, it was a catalyst for me to want to make that sacrifice matter. And so coming out of West Point, I just wanted to be part of this profession and rebuild it. And it was pretty clear, if not rebuild, I mean, it wasn't broken, but it needed to be adapted and rekindled. And I wanted to be part of that because I saw that some had thought enough of it to lose their lives for it and this country. So make it matter. Whatever you do in your life, just be able to look yourself in the mirror and know you've made it matter.
And you have, General Dempsey. Thank you. You've accomplished what your goal was. And thank you so much. And Secretary Hagel, both of you, I think it's a privilege for us to be able to sit here and listen to people with such great experience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.